Welcome to this Ivey Impact live session, Budget 2025, Insights for Business. I'm Julian Birkinshaw, Dean of the Ivey Business School, and I'm delighted to be your host and moderator. This is Prime Minister Mark Carney's first federal budget, one his government defines as a generational shift. It comes at a critical time when the world is changing rapidly and there is considerable volatility. There are geopolitical tensions, Canada's relationship with the US has changed, the global economy is slowing down, and there are growing concerns about national security. The central question for all of us is whether this budget truly creates the necessary conditions for stronger economic growth and future prosperity for Canada. Does it strike the right balance between bold investment and fiscal discipline? Does it give Canada and Canadian business the tools they need to thrive? To address these questions, we have an outstanding panel with us today. Arlene Dickinson, founder and general partner, District Ventures Capital, and a member of Prime Minister Council on Canada-US Relations. Perrin Beatty, former president and chief executive of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and former federal cabinet minister. Finally, Mahmood Nanji, Power Corporation of Canada Policy Fellow at the Lawrence National Centre at Ivey Business School and former Associate Deputy Minister of Finance, Government of Ontario. With their help, we'll explore what this budget means for business, for investment confidence, and for Canadians navigating an uncertain global economy. I also encourage you to drop questions for our panel into the Q&A function. We'll do our best to get to your questions near the end of the discussion. The session is being recorded and will be made available on the Ivey Impact site. With that, let's just dive right in. And I'll go to all three of you for a few quick reactions from what you heard in the budget. What were your top line takeaways? Perrin, we'll go to you first on this. I can't hear Perrin.
Sorry, you should be able to now.
Okay, Perrin, let's do it again.
I think the first thing is the criteria in which we judge the budget. What were we looking for? If we were looking for a financial plan for the next year, I think it's pretty good. And people comparing it with what we had for the previous decade would say it's a significant improvement because they're focusing on areas where there may actually be a return for the spending that we're making. That's a good thing. But if you look at the document in a different way, if you say Canada's at an existential moment of crisis, and what was needed was to set out a very clear plan that makes it clear to Canadians what the challenges are that we're facing and gives a clear strategy for us to get to where we need to be. In that regard, it falls short. For those who are old enough to remember the Paul Martin budgets in 1994 and 1995, what we needed was the 1995 budget where Paul Martin was very clear about the problems, very clear about what the government was going to do about them. Instead, what we got was the 1994 budget.
And the 94 budget was more modest. Sorry, I don't claim to remember what was going on.
You're much too young for that.
Yeah. Thanks. So for your point of view,
it was directional, as this is directional.
Yeah, exactly.
But what it didn't do is it didn't build the confidence that we had these problems under control. And as the year progressed, we saw concerns that the IMF might step in Canada. We saw the Wall Street Journal talking about the Canadian peso and referring to Canada as an honorary member of the third world.
Not good.
So much of the exercise needs to be about building confidence, both in Canada and around the world, that we understand our problems and we have a plan to deal with them.
Right. So it doesn't quite hit the mark of generational, I think is the Mark Carney's term for you. Fair enough.
Except in the deficit.
Understood. And we're going to get into almost like the mechanics of how big the deficit is shortly. But Mahmood, what are your top line takeaways?
So Julian, I found this to be a very ambitious and expensive budget. I think it's credible. I think there's a reasonable game plan there, but there are also lots of big risks here related to whether the government can actually implement all of those initiatives that it's announced. There's the risk of further shocks. We don't know what Trump's next trade policy initiative is going to do and how it will impact Canada. They're making a big bet on attracting private investment, which hasn't been very successful over the last several years. And then, of course, as Perrin mentioned, the fiscal sustainability issue. So if I can use the baseball analogy, albeit raw for Blue Jay fans, they didn't hit a home run. They then strike out. They're on base, and perhaps they're in scoring position. Another way to look at it is maybe to say it's a good start and maybe part one of what needs to be a trilogy, or maybe there's a part two to come.
Indeed, for sure. Arlene, what are your reactions when
Well,
you read it?
Perrin, I am old enough to remember that, so I'll take the point that I'm old enough. But I think what you both said is right. I do think that this budget really addresses real structural issues like productivity, competitiveness, infrastructure gaps. I think it recognizes that incremental change isn't going to move the needle and that we need bold action. I like the defense spending because that acknowledges the fact that we have some security realities that we have to address. And I like the trade diversification because that's long overdue. We've, given our U.S. Relationship. I think it hits the mark on all of those points. I think where it misses the mark is, as you've heard, the executional risk is quite large. To try and deploy that kind of money and that kind of capital in a 5-year period is ambitious and is going to have a lot of risk attached to it. And the deficit trajectory is concerning if we're not getting the results that we need. So making sure that we're actually putting accountability in place to the dollars that are being invested is going to be very important. And the timeline, it's ambitious. And I like ambition. I'm an entrepreneur. I think ambition's great, but we need to be able to make sure that we can deliver on that ambition.
Got it. So let's just look at the numbers. So I think we're projecting a deficit next year of $78 billion, and with a plan to gradually reduce that, but separating out, if you like, operational spend versus sort of capital investment. And if you look at Canada's overall debt numbers, debt as a relationship to GDP, Canada, I checked the IMF data on this, and they reckon Canada's going to be at around 110% of debt to national GDP, which sounds like a pretty big number, but of course, it's actually lower than the US. It's about the same as places like the UK and France. It's way, way lower than Japan. So I think the question to all of you, maybe I'll go to Mahmood first on this, is, as you look at the fiscal situation, does this sort of number make you nervous, or are you actually comfortable that we've got plenty of what they sometimes call fiscal headroom for more borrowing?
So, Julian, there's reason to be concerned here. And if you think a little bit about what happened during the pandemic, one of the reasons Canada was able to respond so effectively to the pandemic is the fact that it actually had some fiscal capacity, what we used to call the fiscal dividend. So
Right.
it was able to do all of those programs. Now, at that time, our debt to GDP was at about 36 or 37%. Now it's going to go up to 43% or 44%.
And this is federal debt. I think
Exactly.
the numbers I quoted are much, much bigger because you're adding all the different sources of debt in. Right?
And it's also all levels of government as well. So that's the distinction as well.
Yeah,
At that time, we were paying 6 cents on public debt interest charges. We're now going to be paying 13 cents for every dollar that the government gets, right? Back to Perrin's thing about 1995. So I happened to be a young analyst in the Treasury Board at that time, and the Globe and Mail used to have this really interesting piece one day, and it showed the Canadian loonie, and the risk was that 50% of every dollar collected by Canada was actually going to go to service the debt. So that's why we need to really be concerned about this. I think the thing the government missed on this budget with respect to the fiscal situation is it didn't go hard enough, to Perrin's point, in terms of the savings. I think that the government could have really looked a lot harder in their comprehensive expenditure review with higher targets, and more importantly, look at some of those social programs. OAS and GIS, as I've said before, is going to be $100 billion by the year 2030. There's a lot of people who make more than $100,000 who get the seniors benefit. The question is, that program in EI really are long overdue for review.
And so your point is, of course, that it feels bad to be essentially spending our money just to service debt. But the hard evidence is that there's plenty of room for more if we wanted to be super aggressive about it. And I think, Perrin, that's your point, isn't it? Which is that there is actually room to borrow more at a time of, if you like, existential crisis.
Yeah, my argument wouldn't be that we should be borrowing more,
Oh, it's
but
not.
that the government has to demonstrate that it has our fiscal challenge in place. And to go back to the 1995 budget, everything in 1995 was about fiscal management. Could we get the deficit under control? This is much broader than that. There's an existential crisis. Our productivity was poor before the last election. It was poor for many years. We were sliding in our competitiveness compared to other countries. And then on January 20th, what we had was Donald Trump was sworn into office. We have somebody there who doesn't believe that Canada should exist and is determined to take large chunks of the Canadian economy and move them across the border into the United States. It comes down to a question of confidence. Are Canadians and our investors confident that we understand our problems and that we have a plan to get to where we need to be? Paul Martin was very clear about the role of government. It's worth remembering what he had to say. What he said is, what is the role of government? He said it's to provide a framework for the private sector to create jobs through responsible policies on inflation, on taxation, regulation, trade, and the labor market. It is to do what only government can do best, and to leave the rest for those who can do better, whether business, labor, or the voluntary sector. I'm not hearing that here.
So let's actually go to Arlene on that, because, yeah, I think many of us would agree with that sentiment that the government's job, particularly when it comes to business, and Ivey is a business school after all, when it comes to business, business likes to be as unfettered as possible. Business likes to have the right conditions for investment and for enterprise and so forth. Arlene, what do you see in the budget that would support or not business investment and business vitality? Oh, you seem to be on mute.
Sorry. I see it really varying depending on the continuum you are on in terms of where your business size and age is. So if you're a more mature business that's investing in manufacturing or investing in, capital expenditures of any kind, thinking about infrastructure, defense, et cetera, manufacturing at that level, you're going to do very well with this budget. You're going to be able to double down. You're going to be able to grow. You're going to be able to exceed expectations. So at that level of business, I think from an infrastructure perspective, it's a very strong budget. It's going to do very well in terms of tax credits, in terms of other opportunities and other incentives. If you're an early stage startup and you're an entrepreneur, you're going to struggle with this budget. You're not going to get the type of resources and commitment you need to really expand your reach as it relates to exports and to other areas of development. So I do think, but to Mahmood, to his point, this is the first budget. And, I think we can only anticipate that given, the minority government and everything else, that we're going to see, changes as we continue to see subsequent budgets come out.
Understood. And I think, well, my take on it is quite similar. I mean, this was a budget about investment, and obviously a big part of Carney's plan is if we put public money in, bit private money will follow. That is certainly the intention. It does remain to be seen how effective it is. Let's turn to trade, because Perrin, you obviously mentioned what's happening south of the border, and any conversation about Canadian competitiveness and future plans regrettably end up coming back a little bit to the way that Trump is viewing us. Let's talk specifically about the trade situation. Obviously, this has been a story much told over the years, brought into sharp relief right now. Canada, you know the numbers, but let me make sure that the audience knows the numbers at the moment. We're talking about something like 70+% of all Canadian exports go to the US, far, far exceeding number 2 and 3, which is China and the UK. That has been the case for many, many years. So I think it is worth going around, all three of you, to take your thoughts on, is there anything in this budget that supports the intention to try to reduce our reliance on US exporting, or indeed US trade as a whole? Who wants to go first on that? Perrin, do you want to jump into that one?
Well, let me give an equivocal answer. I hope that there is. I dearly hope that we're able to diversify our trade. If you believe, as I do, that we're at an existential moment for Canada, one of the things that we desperately need to do is to reduce our reliance on the United States. For the rest of my lifetime, the single most important relationship Canada will have, whether in trade or in security, will be with the United States. But we need to reduce that incredible imbalance that there is today. I was looking at some of the history. If you go back to pre-Confederation times, Canada's always depended upon two key markets. One was Britain, the other was the United States. Britain is much less of a factor today than it used to be in the past. We have so many of our eggs in that American basket. If you look at it, I was looking at a figure the other day that was suggesting that in the 1950s, the US consumed about 60-something% of our exports. By the time of the Macdonald Royal Commission, the figure was up to about 75%. Following free trade, it went up to over 80%. Today, it's about 75%. Everything that we've done over the course of this time to diversify our trade, and we've talked about it often, has failed. And we need to change. Just one other comment to make, that if you look at it in terms of trade agreements, Canada's in a very favorable position. We have more trade agreements with more people perhaps than any other country in the world, more free trade agreements. And that should be great. But a free trade agreement opens the door for you. Right. It doesn't guarantee that your business is going to pass through the door. And that's where our focus needs to be.
Got it. Okay, so Arlene, we'll go to you next on trade with the US, trade with the rest of the world. You're a business person. I mean, what prospects do you see for improvements on this?
I mean, I hear what Perrin's saying, but I would argue that, we've had expansive trade agreements in place for a long time. Harper put a lot of trade expansion programs in place. The doors weren't walked through by industry. The issue wasn't a government issue. The issue was an industry issue, that there was a complacency that said we were going to only trade with our most available, readily, right there neighbor who seems to, give us free trade access and is easy to do business with. And so I think industry really failed to take advantage of the export trade agreements that were in place and are going to be now in place even to a larger extent under Carney. So, listen, I think there's the $5 billion trade diversification corridors fund. That's meaningful. That's meaningful infrastructure. That's going to, investment in infrastructure, that'll matter. There's the trade.
Sorry, say a bit more about that, just to make sure everyone knows what you're talking about.
Sorry, so there's a $5 billion trade diversifications corridors fund that's going to actually help ensure that there's going to be infrastructure to allow from a transportation and all other aspects of trade to be able to be actually implemented well. So I think this is actually very meaningful and very important. There's the Trade Diversification Office to make sure that there's centralized coordination, because that hasn't happened before. I mean, as I said earlier, though, I'm quite worried the SME Export Readiness Initiative, which is, I think, $45 or $46 million. That is not enough money. That is not big enough. We've got 10,000 small businesses that are trying to scale. That's $4,000 each. It takes you 20 times that to go into another foreign market and try and do business. So there's just not enough money there. But I do think that we've got, these growing markets in Asia Pacific. We've got 3 billion people in that marketplace that we have ignored for far too long, while we focused on 300 million people to our south. And so I think there's a real opportunity here and that we should take advantage of it.
Yeah, and it's human nature, as you say, to go with the ready market on your doorstep. But obviously, Carney going to Asia on a trade mission, on a PR mission, a political mission, is emblematic of the direction of travel. But yeah, I know enough business owners, business leaders to realize that any attempt to open up these new markets takes a long time. I mean, it really does. This is a 5 to 10 year project, right?
Sure, but it's achievable. And I think whenever there's next time our PM goes to those markets, I hope he takes along with him several experienced senior business people, so the industry can meet with industry while government's meeting with government. Every opportunity to create relationships is going to be critical, and we need to be over there far more than we are. But they are a ready market. I was just in Singapore, Japan, Thailand. This is a market that wants Canadian goods, but doesn't understand us enough and doesn't have the relationships because we haven't fostered them.
That's right. No, we absolutely start with in a good place in terms of people know and respect the Canadian brand, if you like, around the world. Mahmood, what are your thoughts on the whole US-Canada trade relationship and the need to diversify into new markets?
So this budget does focus quite a bit, and we've heard the Prime Minister on several occasions talk about our over-reliance on the United States and how that's become a vulnerability. I agree with what Arlene just said, which is that, look, there are some elements in this budget that will help the trade diversification, but one budget is not going to change that.
Right.
And so you're going to need to have a sustained effort here to move. And Arlene's point is bang on. And I use this word reluctantly, but it's kind of true, which is to say that, as Arlene said, industry, business, small, medium-sized enterprises have become rather lazy. It's been all too comfortable to look to the South to export, 77% of our goods. And trying to find new markets has been always difficult. The most important thing about the trade thing here for me is we have certain industries which are really vulnerable, and we've seen that over the last few weeks. Right. We've seen, the tariffs on steel and aluminum at 50%. That is not sustainable. If that stays on, that industry is going to collapse, regardless of how much domestic consumption we have. The auto industry is hugely at risk. In the mid-1990s, Canada used to produce 3 million vehicles. Today, it produces 1.3 million vehicles. Now, there's an opportunity there for that advanced manufacturing to shift to perhaps doing defense industrial stuff. So there are opportunities that exist there. And then, of course, we've got the softwood lumber issue as well, too. So this transition is going to be really difficult. And I think we need to certainly find some, markets overseas. And that's going to require a lot of effort on the part of business, but also for government to guide some of these businesses into new territories that they're not familiar with. Yeah. It's very comfortable to know your own background, the United States, similar kinds of laws, currency, language, all those kinds of things. This is a tall order for many SMEs.
Yep. And we have the specter of a renegotiation of the CUSMA or USMCA agreement next year. I believe it was scheduled, and it was meant to be a fairly minor thing, but there's now a risk that Trump uses as an opportunity to do even more extreme things. Mahmood, any thoughts on that? I mean, I'm not asking you to project how that will go, but
you're absolutely right, Julian. I think that CUSMA negotiations is a huge risk. I think the era of free trade or comprehensive free trade is over. I think with the United States, I think you will see a new regime here, and Trump has mused about this, and we've seen it from some of the other deals. I think we're going to see several sectors still having tariffs under a new CUSMA. The issue is how much of that stuff is going to be contained. And of course, that anytime there's a tariff on those goods, it raises a number of questions. One is it increases the price. Two, it reduces the demand. And three, it gets businesses to think, why am I in Canada? Maybe if all of my customers or most of my customers in the US, maybe I'll relocate over there. And that,
which is what Donald Trump wants us to do, as you know. and not surprisingly, we're all resisting that. And we're saying there's not enough, clarity on his strategy to ever start making major investments there, even if we wanted to do so.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Perrin, thoughts on that point? I'm going to move on to defense spending in a second, but any last thoughts, Perrin or Arlene, on trade?
Yeah, we don't know how this is going to end up, and we're not even certain as to what the state of the negotiations is at this point. But it is likely that at a minimum, the best case scenario is probably that we are facing a series of annual renegotiations of NAFTA. Which create uncertainty for investors looking at where to put their money. It's clear that we're going, and the Prime Minister certainly signaled this, we're going to end up having to pay tariffs that we weren't paying at the beginning of January. Likely the focus is going to be on sectoral agreements with the United States at this point, as opposed to the overarching one. But it is the lack of clarity that's part of Trump's strategy here. Canadian investors are uncertain about what the conditions are going to be in which they make their investments. They will either hold back from investing or they'll go to where their customer is in the United States.
Exactly. And we are indeed the evidence. I forget the number, but business investment has slowed to a trickle, and it's not because of all this uncertainty. And the statistic I saw, again, you probably know this, but at the moment, something like 85% of Canada-US trade is tariff-free because it's CUSMA compliant. And it feels hard to believe that that number is going to stay as generous or as good as that. It feels like it's only going to get worse. Arlene?
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly not the only country dealing with the impact of Trump's tariffs and how he's navigating the whole geopolitical, in fact, creating it by shifting sands and,
Indeed.
you know, basically doing what he wants to do. I think, you know, listen, if we think it's going to go back to where it was, it's not. There is no way it is. You know,
Right.
he has his own agenda. He's clearly shown his hand as to what he's trying to do. That means it's really incumbent on us to think about how we can find new export markets and how we can actually do a better job internally. You know, provincial trade barriers. You know, like ensuring that we're procuring from government for our own businesses, like being our own best customer. There are things that we can do. Certainly, they don't offset the loss of what, you know, 70% of our trade is going to, losing that is going to mean. But if we can expand our trade markets into other regions, if we can open up our trade barriers internally, if we can procure from ourselves, if we can create better tax and regulatory environments to work in, then we can create business and then we can grow this country in a way that's meaningful. And, you know, so I think, I mean, I'm optimistic about our opportunities, but I am, you know, I'm worried about the risk that we are taking here if we don't all believe in it. And I think that's a really important point. You know, the provinces are off negotiating on their own. That is not going to help us. You know, like we need to work together. We have to have one voice. And as Perrin has said, you know, several times, and I agree, this is an existential crisis.
Yeah.
We have got to, you know, be together on this.
Exactly. And as many people have said, the silver lining to the Trump cloud is the Canadian national unity opportunity. And this is really genuinely a chance to do things that have been talked about for many years. We'll come back to kind of almost like implementation and sort of practical aspects towards the end. Let's shift to defense. Yeah, please,
Julian,
go
if
for
I
it.
could just make one point. I think that, look, as gloomy as the trade front looks, I think there are things that, you know, Canada has lots of strengths on. And to both the points that Arlene and Perrin made, I think we need to leverage those. That is, you know, in the critical minerals side of things, you know, we've been very, very slow on that front, and we really need to accelerate that. The energy exports piece, you know, Canada is a global leader in AI. So those are all opportunities for us to use for finding global markets.
No, that's right. I remember an article in The Economist talking about Canada as, you know, the next sort of resource superpower because of all of these things that the world needs. Now, that is a very long-term view, I take it, but and I do believe that the budget is at least trying to move us in that direction. One little
Julian,
please.
I think it's important as well that we not descend into gloom, that we be realistic about where we are and the size of the challenge and the degree of the threat that there is against Canada. But I believe that if we have the vision, if we have the will and the determination, and if there's the unity in Canada, we should be declaring January 20th to be Canadian Independence Day. That this is the first day at which we make the decision that we're going to take our own future into our own hands. We can do that, and we can have a much brighter future if we do.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and we will undoubtedly over the next half an hour go through another couple of bouts of sort of things are difficult, but we have to remain optimistic. I want to move to defense. So the data is we've committed to defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035 and 2% of GDP in the current year, which is a substantial increase. And as I think most people will know, the government's already committed to a new defense investment agency, coincidentally to be led by Doug Guzman, who is an Ivey grad and somebody well known to myself and many of our colleagues here. Let's talk a bit about that. Is this overly ambitious? How will that be a smart strategic move for Canada in terms of both centralizing power close to Mark Carney, as well as trying to essentially buy Canadian rather than buying American? I think some sort of 2/3 of Canadian defense spending is currently done in America. Who wants to go first on that. Perrin, do you want to speak up?
I guess I'll take, as the former defense minister, I'll take
Indeed, you know a little bit about this.
a shot at it. I think this is potentially one of the bright spots if we're strategic about it. I strongly recommend that everybody online get a chance to read Alan Levine's book, which was just published in the last week or two. It's called The Dollar a Year Men, and it details how Canada was able to transform itself from having virtually no defense industrial base whatsoever at the beginning of World War II to ending the conflict just a few years later as the world's fourth largest supplier of military equipment, after the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. This was a transformation that was transformative in terms of defense, but transformative more broadly in terms of the Canadian economy. And we came out of it as a much more industrialized, successful nation as a result. There's a potential for us here to use this defense spending in a positive way. There's some issues, though, here for us to look at. I think we need to have a clear strategy in terms of how we're going to use that money. People are going to be lining up, looking for contracts. You'll hear provincial premiers talking about getting our fair share of the spending. The first issue is how have our defense needs changed? I think we have to ask ourselves, for example, have we learned anything from Ukraine? And if so, what's that? Given that we can't do everything, where do we need to focus? We can't be all purpose. What are our priorities here? Third, how can we ensure that we build our sovereignty instead of compromising it? When I was defense minister, Admiral Thomas, the head of the Navy, put it to me very directly. He said, "Minister, you can have as much sovereignty as you're prepared to pay for. We can't do this on the cheap. We have to be prepared to put our money literally where our mouth is." And then finally, where are the areas where it makes sense to build a defense industrial base here in Canada? There'll be a temptation, including among the military, because they're seeing the platforms rusting out under them, to simply go out and buy stuff as quickly as possible. And that means writing big checks to American companies and tying ourselves in even more closely to American foreign and defense policy. That shouldn't be the purpose of this exercise.
Yeah. So let me just push you. I mean, it's for my own sake as much as anybody else's. I mean, what happened to these Canadian companies that used to be, fourth most successful in the world in terms of defense? I mean, these have atrophied over time, and I'm assuming therefore that the process of building them back up is going to be quite long and painful, is it?
Most of them converted to peacetime production, or in some cases they were wound up entirely. The equipment may have been sold, and manufacturing equipment may have been used by other companies, for example. So we're not starting from scratch. There's expertise in Canada. We need to identify, though, where are the niches where a literal investment by Canada will bring returns, and where we'll be able to meet both our own needs and be able to sell to other countries as well, to allies.
Right. Because obviously, I read something from defense procurement to defense production. I mean, investing in Canada to create our own defense capability. I mean, the risk is, of course, that actually procurement, whether it's in the US or Europe or wherever, is actually a more efficient use of Canadian taxpayer dollars than building it up yourselves.
I understand that argument, and it is also, by the way, that I think a key part of Trump's strategy on pushing the allies to spend more is guess where the dollars go.
Indeed,
They
are the world-leading defense companies in many respects.
And we can't, Julian, we can't do everything here. We aren't going to resurrect the Avro Arrow, but there are niches where we can develop technologies that are going to be valuable both for defense and for civil purposes as well. Remote sensing is an area where Canada has showed real leadership in the past. There are a number of areas where we have potential to boost our economic growth as a result.
Mahmood, let me go to you next, because obviously this is partly about spending the money in the right places, but it's also about centralizing responsibility and authority at the heart of government. Now, that is obviously to some degree bypassing many of the traditional places where these decisions were made. Any thoughts on that? I mean, in some ways it seems smart, because it does almost certainly mean that we can get some immediate efficiency gains. Is that right?
Absolutely. So, Julian, if you would have asked me this question 2 years ago about the importance of defense, this was not on anybody's list. It wasn't a top priority, notwithstanding the fact that our military and defense had been neglected. And so in this budget, you see that the government really focuses, because 45% of the new money actually is going to defense. But to your specific question, I think the creation of the Defense Investment Agency is a really good idea. And it draws the point that Perrin's making about defense procurement. That can become a sort of a hornet's nest, right? And it can also lead to a lot of wasteful spending as well, too. We've all heard about the U.S. Defense Department spending, $10,000 on a hammer, right, on procurements. And you don't want those kinds of things to happen. So I think having a dedicated agency looking after that rather than the more broader procurement, I think is a huge boost. I think there's a couple of other things. The other point that Perrin made is a really important one. We're not going to be making fighter jets and submarines overnight. We have some of those capabilities. We don't have most of those capabilities, and there's world leaders to do that. But we can really be important inputs to the supply chain there. The other important thing about the defense spending, really, I think it is an excellent transition strategy for the sectors that are most vulnerable that I talked about earlier. So some of the expertise that actually exists in aerospace, in the steel and aluminum industry, in the auto industry, some of those skills, some of that talent, some of that capacity can be shifted effectively to the defense side of things. And I think hopefully the agency will coordinate that and deliver the results desired.
Thanks. I want to move to talent and immigration in a second. Arlene, anything else on defense before?
No, I would add one small thing, which is, I think a big thing, which is Russia and China are circling the Arctic on a regular basis. And we have, if we care about our sovereignty, if we care about what we're doing, this strategic investment is incredibly important. And I fully support the dollars that are going behind defense. I think Perrin's point on, are they going to, equipment? Is it going to personnel? Is it going to technology? Where is it going to go is actually the next leg of it. But I think it's very important.
Thanks. So let's talk about people. There's a question around talent shortages in some sectors and layoffs in others, and the need to match supply and demand. Then in terms of what the budget actually says, I'm quoting some numbers here, reducing permanent resident admission by 4%, that's about 15,000 people, reducing temporary resident admission by some 300,000. That includes, among other things, students. We have a few significant concerns at Ivey about that, not just Ivey, I mean universities in general, though I do believe that graduate students will be exempt from that number, which is certainly quite good news. But Arlene, let me ask you first, because the business sector absolutely, Canada as a country, not just the business sector, relies on immigration. It has done forever. And yet we all understand that there are political pressures around keeping those numbers in check. Do you feel that this is the right sort of step to be taking at this moment?
I worry a lot about it. I mean, I don't know how we're going to build 5 million homes in the period of time when we have less people, less temporary workers and less skilled workers available to us. So there's already a work shortage of qualified workers. And this is problematic. Like, we have to build those homes. How are we going to build those homes without those people? I think, we have over indexed on correcting an immigration policy that was not as good as it should have been and wasn't optimized the way it could have been. And instead of saying, let's make that immigration policy stronger again, we actually have kind of gone the other way and said, let's have less people coming into our country. We need more people in our country. We need more resources. We need, the right people in our country. We need to, have the right immigration policies. But I feel like this is, to me, this one I didn't understand this one.
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to ask Mahmood and then Perrin your thoughts on this one, because do you agree with Arlene?
Yeah, I do. I think, the issue, I think the government was in a really awkward position with respect to the immigration issue. You've got unemployment that is increasing across the country. You've got some issues on the social side of things, pressures on the healthcare system, on housing, some of it which was, inappropriately directed towards immigration and temporary residents. So perhaps there's a bit of an overreaction there.
Mm.
The challenge that I find is that coming out of COVID, a lot of businesses, particularly in the services sector and accommodation sector, and hospitality, were saying we can't attract enough people to work in our places, and therefore we can't run our businesses effectively. And so there was a lot of pressure for the government to introduce increased number of temporary foreign workers, I think. Now, the issue is that when you cut back these numbers to the level that you're going to, what is that going to do to the services sector, to the hospitality sector, and things like that? And I wonder whether there's going to be some unintended consequences of this policy. So there's the other piece, which is attracting the best and the brightest, and they've got a fund for that, and that's great. But there's this other area, which is our other industries. Will they be able to survive with these significant cuts? And I think that's the real question here.
Yeah. Well, you won't be surprised that I'm currently a temporary resident, not even a permanent resident. I'm not in favor of this policy. One day, perhaps I'll get my permanent residency status once it's worked its way through the system. But from an Ivey point of view, we absolutely see the need to be not just bringing in people from the best and the brightest from around the world, but also, creating opportunities for those people then, to sometimes take jobs overseas and then maybe come back to Canada. So I do see that if you look across the world, we follow the US politics quite closely. All of us do. I follow the UK politics quite closely. Every English language country in the world, frankly, every developed economy in the world they're all going through this process of trying to be much more cautious about immigration. And I would love Canada as one of the countries which has got the most opportunities to take a positive step. But I do understand the political realities as well. Perrin, what are your thoughts on immigration?
Well, Julian, you're absolutely right. We're seeing doors closing around the world.
Yeah.
What did make Canada unique in the past is that when you polled the one country in which the majority of people felt immigration was a net positive that created opportunity, created growth and wealth, the one country was Canada. Yeah. Unfortunately, we lost control of the system. Yeah. And what you had was an influx that was so large that it simply couldn't be accommodated at the level that it was at. The question now is, has the government swung too far in the other direction with the impacts it will have in terms of talent and a whole range of other areas? My worry in the short term, and certainly when I was at the chamber, what I would be hearing from businesses was we need to get our hands on the talent that we need wherever it is, anywhere in the world, and we're having difficulty doing that. The question for me at this point is, the concern for me is that as we turn the taps strongly the other way, that we are missing an opportunity that is a generational opportunity. Yeah. And that's that we were able to start cherry picking around the world the finest brains in the world, the best talent, to bring them to Canada as other countries close their doors. Now that's much more difficult. And even for the universities, we hear talk because of Trump's war on the universities in the US that Canada should be recruiting from the US. Right. I'd be interested in hearing from you, Julian, whether Western has a budget that's large enough to make it attractive for somebody to move here from the US. I'm not sure we have the money.
No, I mean, the situation is I get calls, not many, but a few calls from professors in the US saying, have you guys got any opportunities? We'd love to move north. And frankly, the higher education financial situation is so bad that right now we do not. It's as simple as that. I mean, maybe in a year or two's time, but with provincial funding for students capped, with of course international student numbers capped, we're in a tight spot. And not just Western. I mean, Western is prudently managed. Western's got stronger balance sheet than most other universities, but none of us are hiring. It's a really rather worrying situation, I'll be honest.
Arlene, what an opportunity we're missing as a country.
We
what an opportunity we're missing.
Yeah,
100%.
yeah,
Arlene.
I was just gonna say that just breaks my heart because you
Yeah.
think about highly educated, highly qualified people who are leaders in their fields wanting to come to our country, and we're not able to accept them because of, like, to me, things that aren't making a lot of sense. So, and if you think about the agriculture, just from that extreme to the agriculture sector that requires, seasonal workers to be able to come in and out of this country, and to do what they need to do. And we don't want to slow down food production because agri-food is such an important element of our economy. 1 in 9 people are employed in the agri-food sector. It's our largest manufacturing sector. There's so much opportunity there. We need seasonal workers to help ensure that our production gets, that our food gets off the field and into production.
Yeah. No, I can only agree with you on that one. So let's talk about climate competitiveness strategy, which was a part of the budget. Then I'm going to move to some of the questions and anything that perhaps was missed from the budget. So there is some stuff in the budget around climate competitiveness, modernizing carbon pricing, clean electricity investment tax credit, investment for low carbon facilities. What's your view? Because obviously Mark Carney has a good record in terms of saying, as it were, the right things about the environment, but I do sense that he's moved, for political expediency reasons, perhaps, away from some of those positions. Mahmood, what are your thoughts on what the budget does for our climate competitiveness?
Well, I think that's precisely why I think they put this whole climate competitive strategy right in the sort of front window there to say, look, we haven't forgotten about climate change just because we got rid of the carbon tax. So I think that certainly this strategy is a reminder that Canada remains committed to the 2050 net zero target. I think it's also one that says, look, the strategy should really be focused around producing clean energy and boosting investment in clean energy. And so I think on that front, if you look at some of the initiatives, including the tax credits, those are some of the best in the world. And I think that Canada really has an opportunity here to be a world leader in clean energy. Remember, the other reason this is in the budget there also was a lot of pressure from out west, from particularly a couple of premiers, who are looking at getting rid of the industrial carbon tax. And I guess the trade-off here was that the government said that it would deal with the industrial emissions cap, provided certain conditions are met. So I think that this is kind of walking a bit of a tightrope here, which is on the one hand, making sure that we remain committed to the goals that we've made, and at the same time ensuring that there aren't all of these other regulatory measures that are put in place, which is going to suffocate, investment. So you can't be doing one thing on one side and then doing the opposite on the other side. And so we'll have to see how this unfolds, but I think this is a positive move.
Yep, got it. Arlene, Perrin, Arlene first. On anything on the climate competitiveness?
I think what Mahmood just said is exactly right. I mean, it is a bit of a tightrope, but they're still, the government still, as far as I understand, they're still committed to the 2050 net zero target. They're,
for sure.
Focus on clean energy production. They're putting, incentives in place for clean tech, clean energy. So I think that they're getting there. They're just getting there differently. So I don't see it going away. I just see it reframed.
Yeah, understood. Perrin, anything on that, or shall we move to some questions?
Julian, this is another place where we need clarity, just really to know where the government is coming from here. Mahmood and Arlene talked about a tightrope that the government is walking. I would use a different analogy, and that would be the dance of the seven veils, where what we're seeing elements of the policy being produced, but we don't know what the policy is. We've seen the scrapping of the carbon tax. We've seen other measures in the budget here, but it's not clear what the government strategy is. First of all, on the development of energy and getting our resources to market, and then secondly, how we reconcile that with the targets that we have to reach net zero. Is that target still achievable at this point, and do we have a strategy to get there? I honestly don't know.
No, indeed. And we've got the COP meeting in Brazil going on, I think, even this week. And that is an attempt, as always, to try to get national governments to get together and take a global commitment around climate. And yet, unfortunately, because of all the other stuff that's going on, it tends to get given less attention than it deserves. But let me move to a couple of questions. There's one about the housing plan. We haven't talked about housing at all in the last 45 minutes. And yet there is some stuff in the budget about that, an attempt to get house building moving. Does anybody want to comment on that? Mahmood, do you have any?
Sure. So in the budget, the government talks about how this is the most ambitious sort of housing plan that's been put forward, sort of $25 billion on this. But let's not forget one important fact. Housing is provincial jurisdiction with the exception of First Nations housing, right? And the challenge has always been this coordination between the federal and provincial governments. And unfortunately, that has often meant that sometimes the housing starts, and particularly in Ontario, we've seen housing starts have actually dropped when they were supposed to increase given the targets we have to meet. So I think there's enough incentives already in there, whether it's the first-time home buyer program, the GST exemption there, whether it's the amount of financial support that's available. I think all of those things are there. I think the most important thing is it's really for the provinces to move faster and to clear some of the regulatory barriers which are preventing the growth of the housing supply.
Got it. Look, we've only got 5 minutes left. I want to move to your thoughts on first of all, what was missing? Are there things that we should have been talking about, or that the government budget should have been talking about that we haven't addressed? And also the whole issue of implementation. I mean, as we said, this is a good start. This is directionally correct, perhaps not as ambitious as we'd like it to be, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Let me go to you, Perrin, first on those two questions.
To me, Julian, it comes back to the fundamental question about what do we need most at this point in our life. The very existence of our country is in challenge. The prosperity for our kids is very much in doubt at this point. Yet in every single crisis, there's the seeds of opportunity as well, if our leaders are wise enough to recognize them. What we need at this point is clarity. We need to be very honest with Canadians about the size of the challenges that we face as a country. And we need to be very clear about this is the plan that we have to resolve these issues and to get to something that's much better. The challenge for us, I mentioned the conversion that took place in World War II, which was stunning. But in that instance, the condition precedent was that everybody was convinced that the very existence of Canada was in question, that it was existential. And there was a clear sense of what needed to be done. And it was for about a 5-year period. The changes that we need to make in Canada are systemic. They're very deep-rooted. And it's not going to happen in 5 years. It's going to take at least a decade for us to do this, and governments will come and go. The challenge for us is to articulate a vision for the country and to maintain the national will as a people as governments come and go to make it happen. If we do it, we can build something that is infinitely better than we have today. Thanks.
Arlene, any thoughts on either what Perrin said or things that we should have been talking about but somehow didn't?
Yeah, I wish we had talked more about supporting an entrepreneurial culture in this country, and particularly earlier stage and growth businesses that are innovating. There wasn't enough talk about innovation happening at those stages, how we're going to actually support them in terms of their growth and their opportunities, whether that's through investment, whether that's through helping them unlock customer marketplaces, or whether that's through helping them acquire talent. And so these fixes are not there yet. Back to the interprovincial, trade barriers, back to some of the regulatory challenges that we have. I felt that there wasn't enough information on that, and there certainly isn't enough capital being applied towards that entrepreneurial sector that is so critical. And then the final point I'd make is 70% of our businesses are in the service, in some sort of service consulting sector business, and the tax incentives that we saw are all for the manufacturing and infrastructure businesses. They are not for the service industries. And so you kind of see this whole vast 70% of our economy trapped without any support. Now, hopefully that'll happen and come with the, recur with the next budget. But right now, I did think those were the two biggest gaps in the policy.
Well, I certainly concur with you on that because, we have the Morissette Institute at Ivey and Western, which is all about trying to promote entrepreneurship, across our student body. And it's evident from what they're doing that there's a huge way to go. I mean, the number of startup companies has been dropping, not going up. The amount of money being put into investment for scaling up businesses is not where it needs to be. I think we've got some not token amounts of money, but relatively small amounts of money, for example, put into AI investment. That is clearly going to be an important theme for the future. So I can only agree with that we would love to see much more. If we want productivity growth, if we want enterprise, government can support this. I mean, they can't do it, but they can absolutely help us to do a better job ourselves in the entrepreneurship sector and in the university sector. Mahmood, any last thoughts from you in terms of what we missed out on before I move to close?
Just a couple of quick points. The first one is, having suffered through many budgets, being involved in them, as Perrin rightly pointed out yesterday, there's always the economics and there's the politics. And the government has so many demands and it can't do everything in these budgets. But I totally agree with Perrin's point, which is I think that the government needs to be really clear with Canadians that there's a really, really tough road ahead. And that message, I don't think, has been heard. I think Canadians are still very much in that mode about what is there in the budget for me. And it's sort of me kind of thing, as opposed to the notion of sacrifices. The second point, more substantive point I'll make is, I think where there's missed opportunities, and to pick up Arlene's point, which is the tax system is long overdue for a review. It's been 6 decades since we've done that. Our economy has fundamentally changed. We need to move from an income-based system to a consumption system if we want to retain our talent, things like that. We can't have talent that is paying 52% of marginal tax rates at $225,000. We will not be internationally competitive there. And the final point I'll make is that I think that the government could have gone much further on its comprehensive expenditure review so that we generate the savings to pay for all of these other things.
Thanks. The last question I just received was, is Canada's personal income tax competitive? No, it's not. I mean, I think I was personally quite shocked to be paying 52, 53% marginal rate. And that does not compare favorably with any country outside Scandinavia, as far as I'm concerned. And so, yeah, that is an issue. It's fascinating that this particular budget said almost nothing about personal tax. And I realize there's only so much you can do in any one budget, but it's fascinating to me that was set aside. We must conclude. That is, in fact, the end of our Ivey Impact live session, Budget 2025 Insights for Business. We've heard compelling perspectives today on whether the Carney government has found the right balance between ambition and restraint, and whether or not it will encourage growth and prosperity. Time will tell. So a sincere thanks to you, to our panelists, Arlene Dickinson, Perrin Beatty, and Mahmood Nanji, for sharing their insights. A recording of this session will be shared with everyone who registered, so keep an eye out for that in your inbox. For other thought leadership from Ivey on current business issues, visit ivyimpact.ca. As you exit the webinar, you'll be presented with a short survey. We would appreciate it if you could please fill it out. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.